I have in front of me a large pack of questions that you have posed, which indicates to me that most of you have been listening very, very attentively to a subject that many of us have not really paid attention to. So, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to be reading some of the questions, and any of our panelists are most welcome to respond to these particular questions. The first one, and please, if your question isn't posed to the panel today, because we have 45 minutes going forward, please don't be offended, because sometimes the discussions can be pretty long. The first question that we have from the floor, these are anonymous questions. The first one is, panel members, what triggers a person to be a psychopath? Is it caused by circumstances or is it genetic? Over to you.
Well, of course, this is the age-old question of nature or nurture. I think it's an element of both. I mean, there's claims nowadays in research that trying to track down all sorts of deviations to a gene somewhere in you. I think the more it gets to kind of social behavior that gets programmed, so to speak, I think it gets more to the nurture. I mean, the person that's physically big in primary school gets his way by bullying others physically, then turns up in the corporate environment, has learned through bullying others that you could get your way. So that's programmed in. So I think we've entered into a big debate that can be argued both ways. I don't know, colleagues, what you think.
Is this thing on?
There must be a green light there. Is there a green light?
Is it on now?
Okay. Can you see the switch at green? There.
In general, I would agree with what Theo is advancing here, is that it comes back to the nature-nurture debate. But in essence, I think it also, well, maybe the answer would stem from how we decide to view psychopathy as simply a form of behavior or as a dispositional construct. The reason why I say that this is a very important distinction is because from a clinical side, psychopathy is often identified and diagnosed as antisocial personality disorder. And that is very much based on behavior. Whereas more recent views on psychopathy is that it is normal personality gone bad. So you can visualize this or conceptualize this as the normal dispositional traits that each and every one of us has, on a combination of those, right? Psychopaths represent the extreme. And if you work on a behavioral or a personality distinction, that would also have implications for whether you consider it to be nature or nurture, whether it is determined by upbringing, other social effects, or whether it is indeed genetic. Maybe just on this point. So someone had the question on what is the difference between sociopathy and psychopathy. The difference is, in essence, the idea that sociopaths and psychopaths behaviorally do the same things. It manifests the same way, but the reasons for it is different. The idea behind sociopathy is that it is an effect of socialization, whereas the idea of psychopathy is that it is a genetic attribute.
Thank you. Albert, the second part of the question was, is it caused by circumstances?
I couldn't care less. Whether your father loved you and held you or not, it's none of my business. Whether you make the life of your colleagues a living misery and or defraud the company of the 500 odd million rand is far more significant.
Thank you. Yes. A pretty candid answer. Another question from the floor. says, surely, based on the damage psychopaths can do, prevention is clearly better than cure. And they say that corporates sustain loss and perpetual damage due to the behavior of psychopaths. What are your views on that, panelists?
Absolutely.
Yes?
Well, I think the problem is that there's really no crystal ball to be able to know beforehand if that person is going to cause that damage, if it's going to defraud the company or make their lives a living misery. I assume there could be tests to that effect, but such tests cannot be 100% accurate. So it seems to me that such an approach that the person posing the question is posing is that it's a utilitarian perspective. You know, that it's better for us to rather have a clean sweep approach and rather remove everybody that potentially can commit this act beforehand. But to my mind, that, you know, I don't know if that's necessarily fair. And I would rather perhaps advocate an approach where we first wait and see if the person in fact defrauds the company or makes somebody's life a living misery, because then we can use, I think, the normal rules of labor law to deal with the person. But I may be wrong.
Thank you. You would find that one of the big challenges that recruiters have is that, and I see many people from the HR division here as well, is based on the fact that recruitment seems to be compliance driven. You do it for the sake that the post has to be filled. And not much care is taken in terms of doing greater background checks. And that becomes, just simply muddies the water a bit further. Another very interesting angle on your presentation, Albert, and the panel, and listen very, very carefully. How do you know when you're being recruited by a psychopathic employer?
When they manipulate your package.
Albert?
I mean, they can get what you deserve, so to speak. In the sense that if it is such an organization, they would select that kind of individual because that individual suits them, and then they're on this merry track together. I mean, the one reinforces the other, as I've emphasized.
I absolutely agree. And Professor Felsman has also written on not only toxic leadership, but toxic organizations. I drew a very simplistic diagram of organization and the individual good versus bad. There are basically 4 generalizations. You have the good organization with good individuals, your stereotypical NGO where everyone is trying their best to do that. You have the bad organization with bad individuals, your typical cash and transit robber. Gangsterism, the typical sociopathic type of behavior. Then you have the bad individual in a generally good organization, which is what we looked at in terms of recruiting and the like. The question that came from the floor is about the 4th category, which is the good individual that ends up in a bad organization. South African legislation makes provision for the so-called whistleblower, the person who has a moment of clarity and realizes that the organization is rotten to the core and the like. Research by a friend and colleague of mine, Hetty Mel, has shown that in South Africa, and it's a shame on all of us, in South Africa, people who have blown the whistle on a bad organization a few years later have been far worse off than before, due to not only the victimization in the organization, but by being stigmatized by other organizations. So yes, if you are a good individual in a bad organization, you are in a bad place. Likewise, if you are a good individual working for a psychopathic boss, or you are the manager trying your best to get around dealing with your psychopathic colleague. So there are no easy answers there.
Any other comments? Marais, I think this may be a question that's directed in your space. It says, how does the law deal with the victims of the corporate psychopath? And they've indicated here being manipulated, victimized, bullied. I think it ties in somewhat with the last question, but I think they want perhaps a legal perspective.
Yeah. Well, there is of course an obligation upon the employer to protect his employees, his own employees. That's often very difficult because you essentially have no recourse against your fellow employees. But the only person that can protect you in that circumstances is your employer. And again, it would depend on your employer from instituting misconduct proceedings, disciplinary action, and the like. Of course, you mentioned whistleblowing now. And whistleblowing is, of course, a very important mechanism through which you can report such a person. The problem often is to whom do you report to? We actually spoke about this today at our faculty board meeting. And the problem is if the person you're supposed to be reporting to the protected disclosure is the psychopath or the person that's bullying you or harassing you, really how do you go about it? So I think it's more of a practical problem. Of course, another avenue that you might have is the constructive dismissal route, stating that because your employer didn't step in to create circumstances that became tolerable to you, essentially your workplace was intolerable and you could not go on with your employment. But yeah, I mean, going the CCMA route is really not for everybody, especially if you've landed your dream job or you don't see a possibility of moving on to another organization, then you might not want to follow that route. So it is, of course, a practical problem.
To their credit, trade unions in South Africa, on the basis of an injury to one is an injury to all, really try their utmost to protect the workers who are members of the trade union. In the white-collar context, and especially in large organizations, it is a problem for those people who are too senior to be allowed union membership, but not senior enough to be able to close the company's doors. They are in a very bad position and have to get outside legal representation and or their own therapists, and they are very much in a position where they have to financially fend for themselves, and it is extremely difficult.
We have a cohort of budding students in our midst, and I have the strange feeling that this may be from one of our students. It says, employing a candidate is like getting into marriage. You take a risk both sides, then the question is, when, where, and when do we strike a balance in terms of the ability, fairness, accuracy, and judgment? In terms of, the assumption made is in terms of employing the correct candidate. Gentlemen? Want to read the question once again?
Yes, please.
All right. It says employing a candidate is like getting into marriage. You take a risk both sides. Then, based on that, the question is, where and when do we strike a balance in terms of the ability, fairness, accuracy, and judgment?
I would say to me, if you talk about two parties that are entering into a relationship using the analogy of a marriage, it is both parties must be willing to invest in the relationship. We invest in the relationship such that in a sense you serve something greater and beyond individual interest in the relationship. The moment you enter into a relationship and it becomes self-serving and for your own benefit, then you are on a road to nowhere. And it also then shows that there's a certain degree of toxicity in that relationship. That's the essence for me of a healthy, constructive relationship, that in a sense you're serving the other party or serving the relationship, in other words, in order to attain something greater than any particular individual interest.
if the question really is from the student bodies and it really is in connection with marriage, a family member of my wife says that both male and female friends of his are fond of saying that if I knew then what I know now, I would never have gotten married. This individual says he has never come across a single person who said, oh my word, I should have gotten married earlier. Now, that story only serves to prove that, yes, you have to go into it, be it employee-employer relations or intimate relations, go into it very, very carefully. The audience is all older than 18, some only barely just, but because we've qualified in terms of age restriction, there's quite an interesting research on the intimate lives of psychopaths, and they are exceedingly good at getting people to comply with their sexual desires. If there's one thing that a psychopath is good at, it is psyching out the person in the room that is sexually available, and then following that up with the requisite manipulation. The research has, however, shown that after this short-lived success, they tend to go from numerous shorter relationships as opposed to a single steady one. The irony of this is that in some circles it reinforces their reputation as a player and it makes them more attractive in that regard, and it just snowballs, which has nothing to do with this.
Another very interesting question that I have here. Sorry, you wanted to respond, CJ?
Maybe just a quick comment in terms of what Albert just mentioned. Part of that research on the abilities of psychopaths to hone in on sexually available people is the idea from an evolutionary standpoint that psychopathy could indeed be very adaptive. So there is also a school of thought that's arguing that psychopathic behavior is only destructive and undesirable depending from where you were looking at. So the point is, it's not necessarily bad. It's undesirable, right? But it depends on your goals. For an organization, maybe, for an organization that seeks to maximize profits with very little ethical regard for all sorts of other forms of legislation, perhaps, employing those types of people could, in fact, be very beneficial for them. So we should really be careful with the argument that psychopathy is just a good or a bad thing. It all depends from where you're looking.
Thank you. I have an interesting one here. It says, do we have psychopaths at UJ? Anyone brave enough to answer? I think I'll just put that aside for now.
Hopefully, at least we've given some tools of identifying such individuals. So go out there and be empowered.
Exactly.
The question centers around how much people at UJ are being paid and how hard they work. You will not find a psychopath in any profession that requires hard, sacrificial, self-sacrificing work. You will find him where there's easy money to be made, where he can pick the fruits of someone else's efforts, take credit for work not done. You will not, in all likelihood, find a psychopath at an academic institution. It also debunks the myth that psychopaths are necessarily more intelligent than the rest of us, because at UJ, by and large, you are all highly intelligent.
Can I just add, it's something that intrigues me, because you very often find it in organizations or where individuals have a a strong need for power, to be in a position of power, to actually maybe use things to their own ends. I mean, that could also be in an academic institution that you have the person that's got this unhealthy need for power and he works him or herself in such a position for the own benefit. I mean, it could be for the stature. We now get so much bad type of academic practices coming through with predatory journals and fake articles and those things that are coming through. So maybe that's the manifestation of a psychopath in getting academic stature and power that's coming through in our space.
Yes, Marais.
Actually, perhaps not a comment, but a question to Albert and Casper. I'm wondering if the psychopath is a lazy person. Because you know that old adage that says if you want to find the best way of doing something, you give it to a lazy person because you'll find the quickest and the fastest and most effective way to do it. So, I mean, I think that might be an interesting thing. And I think in academia, I don't necessarily agree that we're necessarily the hardest workers. I think it's a creative process, and quite often I would stare at a screen for many hours doing nothing, and then all of a sudden creativity would hit, and all of a sudden the words will flow out of you. So I'm not necessarily certain that we're hard workers by definition.
You stare at the screen and then there's a power outage.
Thank you. Albert, I think you have touched upon the following question in your presentation, but just give us an overview though. How do psychopaths behave? And how does one see them in an organization? Basically, I think the question is, what are some of the tendencies that we identify in psychopaths? Very, very briefly, just a few pointers, please.
Okay, first of all, do not become an amateur psychologist. Do not go around labeling anyone a psychopath. You're only going to make an embarrassment of yourself and create possible libels. But there are indicators to look for. Individuals who get poor performance scores but yet are promoted. Individuals whose behavior towards superiors differs markedly from their behavior to people lower down the chain. The psychopath will suck upwards and defecate downwards. So just watch people when they don't realize they've been watching, and see how they interact with juniors and how they interact with seniors. The person whose name is on the list of project team members, but who never pitches up for a meeting, but when the project has been completed, you find him at the office party posing for photographs, hugging the boss. Then the inability to take blame for anything that a person has done is a definite psychopathic trait. Inconsistent behavior, bullying of people, chameleon-like behavior, changing to an extent to manipulate whether the audiences, be they seniors, be they suppliers, be they clients, whatever. A very significant tell is that although psychopaths pretend to be everything to everybody, they cannot help themselves but come into conflict with those that are in a compliance role. The internal audit department, the investigators, the security department, in some instances the human resources department, various subcommittees of the board of directors, all these people are the natural enemies of the psychopath. And if they show any sort of animosity or degrading comments or the like, that is a a very, very definite warning sign for you right there.
CJ?
Perhaps if I could add to what Albert is saying here, is maybe I would like to take a step back. Firstly, for me, the fundamental assumption I think we should get rid of here is that a psychopath is a single thing. That there is one type of psychopath, that it is identifiable, that it's a latent type of construct residing within a person. I think we should get rid of that idea. I think we should become more comfortable with the idea that there could be multiple types of psychopaths, different types of personalities representing subtypes of psychopathy. Now, the big challenge for me, especially in organizational settings, if you work on the stereotypical assumption of psychopaths that's previously been described, oftentimes I think those individuals are already institutionalized, as I said. Now, there's a big discussion surrounding psychopathy, is the component of antisocial behavior. Within organizations, oftentimes, psychopathy takes the form of personality dispositions that are undesirable for people working with these individuals. But the antisocial behavior, the typical bad, overtly bad behaviors are often not observed. The reason for this is what you find typically with the subclinical psychopaths, in those individuals that you would find in organizations that's not institutionalized, is because they can function normally within society. They can appear to function normally within society. So that, I think, compounds the difficulty of the task of identifying these individuals within organizations, because the overtly easily identifiable criteria that you get with a clinical psychopath is absent in the subclinical versions that you would typically find in organizations. Maybe just another point that I'm not sure if I made this earlier is the idea that the base rates for the subclinical types of psychopaths, those that we would try to identify within organizations, are much higher than we would typically expect for clinical psychopaths, being 1% of the population. The base rate for the subclinical or alternative types of psychopathy is around 5 to 15% of the population. And this is a much larger proportion, suggesting that there are numerous individuals that could possibly be functioning very effectively around us, but the task of identifying them is immensely complicated because they don't display the antisocial component of psychopathy necessarily.
For me, I want to maybe revert to where I started. The acid test for recognizing such a person is a person that's on a constant basis only driving his or her own agenda or his or her own self-interest to attain his or her own ends, and doesn't matter what it takes, the means will justify the end of serving that individual.
Thank you. Colleagues, what I'm trying to do is, as time's running out, I'm trying to cluster some of the questions because there's an overlap in some of those questions. But based on, we have now identified what the characteristics of a psychopath are. We are now much more empowered in terms of identifying these types of behaviors in the workspace. The next question therefore leads, we do not like to be abused, but how do we stand up against psychopaths? Is this $1 million question?
Yes, it is. Mickey Pistorius, who is the undoubted heavyweight champion of the world when it comes to identifying serial killers, she has a record of successfully profiling more than 350 serial killers. She has published a number of academic works. She simply says it's time for damage control, get out of that organization. This ties in with the whole construct of the organization having become so toxic that there really is just nothing you can do about it. Much of this depends on the position you occupy in the company. If you are the boss, then yes, really you should do something about having the organisation functioning better, getting rid of bad apples. If you are a junior level person who is in no position to do anything about your abuse, getting out is the better option.
Gentlemen, CJ, you want to add maybe?
Well, if you are reporting to a psychopath, so if you're the subordinate, I would not recommend confronting them directly. A large component of psychopathy is the idea that they tend to be extremely narcissistic, egocentric. So it depends on what your goal is here. But if you simply want to survive, I would suggest a tactic of stroking their egos, placating them, and finding alternative ways to work around them, but not an upfront confrontation. Again, depending on your goal in this situation.
Well, again, I doubt if there's really a labelable solution. The problem with it is, especially when it's your superior officer, I would not know what your remedy is. If it's a co-employee, you can always ask your superior to act against that person, but if it's your boss, your only real option is to resign, get out. But then, of course, then other remedies might start playing. You can, for example, claim that constructive dismissal has taken place because it was intolerable. But again, for most persons, I wouldn't want to lose their job. And it's the uncertainties that goes with that doesn't make that really a good alternative or a respectable one.
I think what makes it even more difficult is that on a comparative basis, South African labour law doesn't make it very, very easy to get rid of people. An interesting article in the Times, was it yesterday or this morning, by a prominent South African businessman, decries the fact that one of the big challenges we have from a South African point of view in terms of the workspace and labour relations is the type of legal framework under which we work in, which really protects these types of individuals within organizations. And that is something for us to take cognizance of as we move forward. So, we've identified the characteristics of a psychopath, and we see just the type of damage that they can do within an organization. So, Albert, the next question is, can we rehabilitate these individuals if we have identified them? What next?
No, you cannot. The experiments done where researchers were doing MRI scans on the brains of individuals, magnetic resonance imaging scans, and what the researchers did was they hooked people up to MRI scans, and then they fed them emotional words. Mandela, minibus taxi, tolerance.
Don't go that emotional.
And then the minor ones, Hitler, Stalin, blah. Okay, what happened in these instances is that normal functioning individuals, the parts of the brain associated with emotions, became active very clearly on the MRI scan. And the psychopath had, well, if you look at the print of the screen, it was pitch black in there where the emotion should have taken place. What the researchers did find is that psychopaths increase their brain activity in the center of the brain associated with verbalization. They know that these words should be emotional to other people, and they are thinking of ways to utilize these words in order to score something from someone for themselves. Now, brain functioning that deviant, I don't think can be rehabilitated. And earlier we referred to Joshelson and Semino's research, which showed that giving these individuals therapy simply increased their ability to manipulate, to find out what the therapist wanted to hear and to feed it back. The short answer is no, they cannot be rehabilitated.
CJ, you concur with that?
On this particular point, I think I would have to disagree slightly. The reason being is, if we're referring to clinical psychopaths, now I'm referring to the 1% of the population, those individuals already institutionalized or in prison. I think that would be an appropriate view, is that they are very hard to rehabilitate. In addition to that, the idea of psychopathy is not necessarily a disorder. It is of a personality that is broken, that needs to be fixed. That's an incorrect view of psychopathy. That might be more appropriate for a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, but for psychopathy in general, especially if you view it as extreme versions of normal personality, that would, if that is the case, if we work on that assumption of psychopathy, especially in subclinical versions, because those are the individuals we are referring to functioning within organizations. So if that is the case, I see no reason why developmental strategies should be deemed absolutely redundant. I think it's too early in the game to make that call. I do agree with Albert, especially if we're referring to the clinical versions of the population, but not for the subclinical population. For the subclinical psychopaths, those individuals that we are interested in identifying functioning effectively or relatively effectively within organizations, I wouldn't agree that there's no helping them out.
I think if I could just, CJ, building on the distinction you've drawn and also tying in the nurture-nature thing, is, I mean, what is the role of behavior? Why do we behave? Behavior helps us to connect with the world and to get things done, achieve certain things, satisfy needs, and that we learn over time. And that's a nurture part of behavior. So it's deeply ingrained, it's kind of our social programming that happens over many years. So I think for the category that you described as the non-clinical group, I would agree with you. I would just add to that, and I think maybe you're saying it by implication, is just tough. Because that's the way I've learned to relate to the world and work and get my way around the world. Now you're taking that away from me, so that is tough, because it kind of becomes my social DNA, if I can put it that way, not my genetic DNA.
Yeah, no doubt, I do agree with that. It's especially tough when these individuals have been flourishing within the organization. So that means by implication that psychopathic behaviors are functioning in an adaptive fashion. It's working for them. So now you want to tell people, no, this is not acceptable, this is not appropriate. So the point, because one of the fundamental assumptions within personality and within dispositions is the idea that people behave according to their dispositions because it is a rational way for them to interact in the world. So if that is the assumption, I agree, it would be exceedingly tough to change those patterns of behavior, but I don't think,
Okay. Out of power.
Thank you. Well, fortunately, we've come to the last question. The last question for today. I'm going to try and be as loud as possible. Maybe perhaps I'll move to the front. The last question, gentlemen, that I have here, I don't know whether you want to directly answer this question, is there a possibility that all of us possess some type of psychopathic tendencies?
Is this since we build up some confidentiality here?
Yes.
As it's not being recorded.
Yeah.
Do all of us have some of these tendencies with us?
I think CJ has made that point. We all have these kind of behaviors. I think when it's become an inherent part of how you behave and you go to the extremes of those behaviors, we all manipulate at some stage to attain certain ends. But as long as it's not a constant and the normal part of my behavioral repertoire, then I couldn't be in that space. But the moment it becomes your way of living, and your way of doing on a constant basis, then you're in for serious trouble. We're not perfect.
The University of Johannesburg. Rethink, reinvent.